Hello, so I'm Harsh Pant. I am here with the Strategic Studies Department, and I'm sitting here with my colleague Pushan Das, and we'll be talking about what has happened post Pulwama, how India has reacted, and some of the consequences in terms of the implications of the use of air power and what it means for Indian strategy going forward, as well as for the questions around Indian air power and Indian Air Force, and what sort of a configuration, what sort of assets it has, and probably and possibly what sort of problems it faces going forward, and what impact it will have on our strategy vis-à-vis Pakistan if we take this trajectory forward. So I think the first thing that one has to underscore in this discussion is the fact that something has shifted in Indian policy. Now that has shifted in Indian policy, that has shifted in terms of how we look at conventional and nuclear deterrence in the region, how we look at what perhaps Pakistan's counter strategy going to be, and going forward, how do you assess in some ways the regional stability more broadly. So there are fundamental questions around some of these issues that this strike has raised, and as we are witnessing today, and the Pakistani retaliation is already beginning, and we are also responding. So there is a cycle that is now in operation. So in some ways, would you agree that something fundamental has been altered in Indian policy, and if so, what are the consequences for Pakistan going forward, both domestically as well as vis-à-vis India?
See, Harsh, the first thing is, yes, there has been a fundamental shift in redrawing the red lines that we thought existed with our adversary Pakistan. The red line that we're talking about is, if we ever went into a conventional conflict, Pakistan had kept the threshold for nuclear weapons use so low that we were afraid they would launch, even if it was an airstrike, if it was special forces operation, if it was a shallow land incursion in maybe the Rajasthan deserts. We always thought Pakistan's first response would be with tactical nuclear weapons, and hence that has always played on the political leadership's mind in New Delhi. That is why we have not responded a number of times over the past 1 or 2 decades whenever Pakistan has provoked us with terrorist strikes which have emanated from their territory. With the successful conduct of yesterday's airstrike, I think we have sort of pushed those red lines back. We can now assume that there is a space for conventional conflict, or at least some sort of conventional operations locally beneath the nuclear umbrella. And I think that is a key takeaway out here, and it opens up India's options in terms of responses it has vis-à-vis Pakistan whenever a terrorist incident happens or there are shallow skirmishes along the border.
So just before we go forward, I think looking back, was it merely a question of political will when it came to the use of air power in such conflicts? We know what happened in Kargil, how decisively Indian Air Force was rejected by then Prime Minister. We also know that Indian air experts have written, Indian Air Force people have written about this, that there is no political will in terms of the use of air power in such conflicts. And air power, by and large, has an escalatory dimension, which one cannot be oblivious to. But has it been merely a question of political will, or was it also a question of simply looking at India's larger globalist strategy in a broader perspective?
Two things. I think, first of all, yes, you're right. Air power has always been viewed as an escalatory measure. So, I mean, if you go back in Indian history, you look at the 1962 conflict, when the Indian army was receiving a hammering from the Chinese army, and on all fronts, there was a political decision that was taken that they would not use air power, because if they used air power, it would escalate the conflict. It might force the Chinese to bring in their air power, or it might widen the scope of conflict. So a decision was taken then. The same decision was taken during Kargil. Yes, air power was used, but it was used only in Indian airspace and Indian territory. In fact, the Indian Air Force had an extremely tough time bombing the Kargil heights from inside territory, because it just wasn't geographically possible. I mean, there were limitations placed on it. But again, the view was air power is escalatory, so we will not use it. Apparently, similar options were given after 2002, the Parliament attacks. Similar options were presented by the Air Force after 26/11 and 2008, but they were always rejected because they were viewed as escalatory. I think this government has in a way, taken a political risk in conducting these operations, because as with all military operations, even air power are prone to risks. What if a plane crashes? What if something goes wrong?
It's already happened.
The political embarrassment is quite huge. As of yesterday, the Air Force did conduct a successful strike, and as I said before, it did open up some sort of space where air power could be used as a mode of retaliation vis-à-vis terrorist strikes which are emanating from Pakistan. But in the larger global context, I would say that India also wants to be seen as a nation which adheres to certain norms and responsibilities, and I guess the onus of limiting conflicts or not escalating it, we have taken it upon our shoulders, and Pakistan has not. And I think that has been one of the limiting factors in the use of air power or any other form of military use.
Yes, it is interesting because if you read Mr. Gokhale's statement, it is largely a very legal document. It reads like a legal document, as if he's preparing a brief, for a court, and where everything is very meticulously mentioned. So this idea of a non-military preemptive strike, where he's covering all the bases for India, and that this is not a target. We are not targeting the military. That would escalate. We are also doing it in self-defense. Therefore, it's preemptive. So I think, in that sense, India has sort of positioned itself, as you were putting it, in terms of the responsible actor category. Responsible India, rogue Pakistan. That has been the difference. And I think that, in a way, is also now being replicated. For example, what Pakistanis have said now today, that it's also a non-military strike against the targets. I mean, similar language is being used because I think they have learned from India certain tricks. But in terms of response, do we now see this escalation that we are witnessing along the border plateauing out? Because ultimately, if you think about it more broadly, this perhaps gives Pakistan that breather, that look, we have done something, and it satiates the public opinion back home. It also brings in brings back the valor of the Pakistani army into contention, and somehow it dissipates. That way they allow the temperatures go down, and India also has an incentive not to escalate it beyond this at this point. But do you think the air and the way air situation is developing, that's where we are going, or the inherent logic of air power would somehow come into question, and we are going to look at a greater escalation happening down the line?
As with the use of any heavy military force, and air power is a very strong military statement, you cannot only stick to non-military targets. I think when the Foreign Secretary made that statement, and we made that statement, it was a very, by design, ploy to stay away from the Pakistani military so that Pakistan can feign ignorance of the strike. And the second issue is, since they have not directly been embarrassed, so to speak, they don't necessarily feel the need to respond. That was yesterday. But even yesterday's operation could have gone wrong. Right? You could have engaged the Pakistani military if, let's say, the Pakistani Air Force was engaged with the Indian Air Force over Pakistani airspace. Even though you were targeting non-military targets, you were still engaged with the Pakistani military. So yes, there's always a spiral of which one can go down if one continues. But what stood out for me yesterday was, after the strike, the Pakistani Foreign Ministry came out with a statement where they said they would find an appropriate response. Now, unfortunately for Pakistan, there are no similar terrorist camps in India which they can target. So the only logical target that they can target are military camps, police, central paramilitary forces camps in Jammu and Kashmir. And I think that was one of the targets that they had today. They did try to attack a brigade headquarters. Yeah. Reports are still unclear whether they managed to hit it, but they definitely dropped some munitions on their way back. And the Indian Air Force intercepted it, and of course there was an engagement with the Pakistani military in the skies. So yes, air power has a very escalatory effect. When one Air Force meets the other Air Force directly, no matter what their stated goal is, whether it's non-military targets or not non-military targets, there's very little that can be done to differentiate that. And the risk of escalation is very high.
So as we go forward, and as we think about the use of air power by India, what are some interesting things that you take away about the Indian Air Force? For example, the issue of Mirage is still being used, or the fact that there is some discussion around the issue of India's Indian air power capabilities at a time when Rafale has been under debate, and also the question of whether India has those assets which are required, the number of squadrons that are perhaps needed by India. So those debates have been happening, and this happens against that backdrop. So in some ways, this will also raise questions about the larger panoply of resources that Indian Air Force has, and what needs to be done to further modernize it.
I think it was striking that yesterday, when the Indian Air Force conducted the airstrikes in Pakistan, the plane that they had to go back to was the Mirage 2000. This was the same plane which the Indian Air Force used in the 1999 Kargil conflict, and it pretty much saved Indian bacon, so to speak. And the fact that it is still the tip of the spear for the Indian Air Force is telling. It's reflective of the fact that not enough modernization has taken place. The second fact is the fact that the Air Force choose to use a Dassault product to conduct, which have now turned out to be successful airstrikes, I think is also telling. I think it's a clear political signal from the Air Force as well that, look, Dassault products work, and it's kind of at least ebbs the arguments and the political campaign that's going on about, India having purchased the wrong plane and all of those debates. But largely, I think we shouldn't get lulled into complacency. Yes, the Indian Air Force conducted one successful strike yesterday, but today we lost a MiG-21 in Pakistan. We may have lost more. Reports still haven't confirmed it. It is reflective that the Indian Air Force is far away from where it needs to be in terms of modernization. We are still flying planes which are 40, 50 years old, the MiG-21, the MiG-27. We are still flying Jaguars. We do not have adequate squadrons. It's a publicly stated thing that to be prepared for a 2.5 front war, they need 42 squadrons. I think right now the squadrons numbers are around 31, 32. We have an extremely high crash rate because our airframes are old. There are maintenance issues. There are pilot training issues. So I think if there's one thing that we need to keep track of is we don't get lulled into a sense of complacency, and the government still needs to effect some sort of modernization plan for the Indian Air Force for it to be effectively able to deter our adversaries or be able to conduct successful military operations.
Yes, so in a sense, the fundamental issue here is how your ends, ways and means are in balance. When you are trying to formulate a strategy to tackle Pakistan, going ballistic or nationalistic is one thing, but I think having the necessary assets in place, having the necessary means in place to be able to have a sustained campaign against Pakistan, because as we know, one-off surgical strike or surgical strike 1.0 or 2.0 will not in and of themselves be enough. So if we want to keep the pressure on, and I think we need the capabilities in our place, and I don't think at this point we are there where we can confidently say that we have achieved the goal. So I think I think what is interesting about this is that it also hopefully will raise some of these more pertinent policy questions for those who are interested in this, and for our policymakers who are very gung-ho about taking on Pakistan, but also have to realize that if you want to do that, you need certain things in place which are not there as of yet. So I think with that, thank you, Pushan, and
Thank you.
Thank you.